Hi there, folks, and welcome to this week's video on stakes and sorcery. So, we're going to talk a little bit here about two subjects, creating tension and investment. And of course, then we will turn to one of the more popular things to get to do in writing a fantasy story, and that is thinking through creating magic, both literal and, I suppose, uh, literary. Okay, so let's start with thinking about the stakes that we create in a fantasy story. So, one of the major challenges is creating stakes and tension. And the reason that I find this to be challenging for a lot of writers is because it is very easy to get caught up in the world that you're creating and ignoring making things meaningful. I have read many a fantasy story that highlight some kind of battle or cataclysm or disaster, and oftentimes what can happen is the why this matters very specifically to the people of this world, why it should matter to me as a reader, is something that becomes unclear. So the an important question to think about is, why is it important that the protagonists succeed? Why do they need to succeed? And you might be thinking, well, don't we want good to overcome evil, or don't you want the protagonist of the story you're reading, to live? Yes, at a very baseline, generalized experience, that's true, but you can only get so far with that. Readers are going to probably readers of fantasy are probably going to have read a good amount of fantasy, and they're going to want some particularized specific reason for reading this story of the many fantasy stories that are out there. So you've got to figure out why it's important for your protagonist to succeed. I think you also want to be able to think through and reveal the answer to the question, what happens if one side wins versus loses? Why will it matter what happens to the world if one group of people win versus another? And why should I, as a reader, care about that outcome? And I think this is the other important thing, and this is how you do this, is thinking about how you place emphasis on individual lives within the greater scope of potential cataclysm. And I use the word cataclysm not necessarily to mean the literal end of the world, though in many fantasy stories that is the case, but what is at stake for individuals in terms of any larger conflict that might be existing, whether it's warring tribes or kingdoms or whatever it is. How do you make me care about an individual's life and what will happen to them in the midst of all of that? I mean, think of your favorite stories and TV shows and movies and whatever other forms of art that fit within this genre. I think the ones that have done that you remember and care about the most probably have specific people, and I'm using that term to include any of the great creatures, great and small, that we might write about. Those have You've probably cared about the very specific characters who are affected by whatever happens at a larger scale. So it's all great fun to create a tableau of a huge battle scene. But think in films, like oftentimes when you have great big battle scenes, the camera doesn't just stay at the big battle level, right? It gets into the individual people who are in the midst of those battles to make you really concerned about their well-being and their outcome. And that's where we feel like we experience stakes. I think for a lot of people, large, non-specific numbers of victims and dead don't actually affect us in the same way that very specific singular experiences do. So think about how you can narrow that focus down with as much frequency as you can. Okay, so let's turn now to magic. So I would argue that after world building, or maybe simply because it's a part of it, because really, as we talked about in that video, the inclusion of a magic system is often part of the building of the world of a story. Magic is maybe the most expected thing, right? So we might have world building being expected the most, but then some kind of magic existing in the world is the other thing that we really expect. So one thing that I will say is kind of along the lines of the things I said about creating creatures in your world, is you want to be careful about not getting overwhelmed by simply explaining magic or deploying it with too great a frequency. Some of you may have heard the term God device before, and that is a principle. It's a bad one. It's a thing to avoid. It's this idea that someone possesses something, whether it's an external tool or internal capabilities, often magical or sometimes technological, that can solve every problem. Many years ago, I was hired by a gentleman to edit a manuscript he'd written. And I don't remember a ton about it, but it was about some twins who turn out to be aliens. And they had powers that could basically transform at will to do anything. And so in every chapter, they seemed to have a new power that precisely solved the problem that they had. And what I told this guy was, after reading several chapters where this kept happening, I experienced no tension in the story because I knew that by the end of the chapter, they were going to suddenly have an ability that solved the problem. And so one of the things to think about is that don't let your magic be deployed so frequently and with such ease that it rips all the tension out of the story. So there's a few things that you want to think about when you're creating a system of magic. And I'm not going to go a whole lot here into like what systems of magic, quote unquote, should look like, because really the possibilities are endless. But there are some things that you want to keep in mind when you are coming up with how magic might work in the world of your story. Magic requires rules of some sort. This doesn't mean that you have to explain how magic is able to function, but there need to be rules that magic follows, whether they are stated or unstated. We may never get like a list of rules or mechanisms by which it works, but we should understand that there is some kind of boundaries to it. There are ways in which it operates somewhat logically. So there should be underlying logic to how magic functions. There should, I think, in good stories be some limits, right? Magic should not be a panacea. Like I said, it should not be a god device that fixes everything. Magic should also have ramifications, meaning I think when someone uses magic, there should be some consequence. You know, if someone can use magic or cast a spell and there is no sort of like energy loss or depletion or result for them of it, it again becomes too easy for characters to fall back on, or for you as a writer to fall back on that magic as a means of getting characters out of trouble. I have read many a draft where it just so happens that magic is a perfect salve for everything. And again, it's a little lazy and it's a little too easy. And then again, careful inclusion. You're going to see in our model text a couple of different ways that magic is incorporated into story. And this doesn't mean that magic can't be ubiquitous and overt. But again, I think you want to be really thoughtful about the frequency with which we are seeing magic, the way that magic is woven into the world. And also, when you're thinking about careful inclusion, you do want to think about how must this world be different than the one I actually live in, than our real world, because magic is there. Whether that is because of the things that it can do for people, the things that it does to people, or the way people act around one another, knowing that magic may be lurking underneath the surface. I sometimes read things where a character's behavior feels too much like our real world behavior, and it shouldn't because of what exists within that world. And oftentimes it's about magic. We'll see characters doing chore X, Y, or Z with magic regularly, but then still having to do chores A, B, and C that seem like they should be able to be done by magic anyway. That's a sort of a silly example, but you just want to think about how does the lens of people's existence change because of the magic that